In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So as many of you know, one of the ways I understand myself not only is as a child of God, a disciple of Jesus, but also as a PK, a priesthood. And being the son of a priest has always been part of my way of understanding who I am. And so I always gravitate towards the PKs in the Bible. So when we get to Advent, I'm sure you'll hear me once again talk about John the Baptist as a PK. But today, we have another one of the great PKs in the Bible, Jeremiah, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. And in the verses that precede today's reading, they weren't included in the lecture today, we learn that Jeremiah is the son of Hilkiah. Hilkiah is a priest, and so Jeremiah is another one of those PKs. So we PKs always got to stick together, we don't secret handshake. And so I want to focus on today's sermon on God's call to Jeremiah, and then have it be a way of us entering into our call as children of God and disciples of Jesus. So the Old Testament opens today with God saying something really extraordinary. And he says to Jeremiah, before you were in the womb, I called you. I knew you, I consecrated you, and I loved you. Now, I don't want this is a parenthesis that I'm going to say, but I think it's really extraordinary what God says in that. Before you were infant in the womb, I called you. Which is to say, I loved you, I knew you. Whenever the Bible uses the word knew, knowing in the Bible means loving. It's part of the same thing. Before you formed, and while I was forming you, I loved you. And the parentheses that I want to put on is this, is in that very contentious cultural debate we have about abortion and pro-life, pro-choice. God has moved my heart to be pro-life, and I would love to have conversation about that with anyone, but I really, one of the influences on me has been the idea that God calls us, as it were, in utero, that God forms us in the womb, that God knows us and loves us, and that's all part of how God is at work already in our life. God's call doesn't come to us postpartum. So again, kind of close parentheses on that, and I felt I needed to share that with you. So God calls Jeremiah, and it's extraordinary. I formed you in the womb, I knew you, I loved you, and it reminds me that calling isn't unique to just the biblical prophets or those extraordinary people of faith that we know in our tradition and in our lives. But God's calling is to each of us. That to understand ourselves is to understand that we are uniquely and preciously formed by God from the beginning. And that we are loved, and we are known, and we are consecrated, and that's part of who we are. You are loved. Now, when I want to say this, it's also to me extraordinary that all this call comes to Jeremiah, and he's only a boy. And that's what Jeremiah says back to him. He says, I'm only a boy. Who am I that you speak to me? So I want to say this gives us an opportunity to reflect a little bit about God's call to this child and children. And I thought about, why is God calling this child, Jeremiah, making himself known? And I was thinking about, children, of course, are often more, I think, receptive to God. They haven't learned how to be cynical. They're receptive to God's presence. They haven't learned to develop their egos. An ego can be a way of edging God out, ego. And the world hasn't quite got its hooks yet into children as deeply. And so there's a receptivity about it. That's why Jesus so often speaks, you have to enter the kingdom of God like a child. I think he's not calling us to be childish. He's calling us to have that openness and receptivity, that humble willingness to open our hearts to God. That is a gift that children often have. It reminds me of a little story that it's a bit cutesy, but it still speaks to me. And it's an angel story. And the story goes that there's a 5-year-old girl, and she's just had a newborn baby sister. And she creeps into the nursery where the little child is, her baby sister, and she leans over and looks into the crib and she says, "Tell me again about the angels. I'm beginning to forget." That somehow as we get older, somehow something is lost. So children have that. And I can't say that I, as a child, ever had this moment that Jeremiah had. But I can say this, that when I was a young teenager, I once spent an entire night in the church. Now, I grew up as a PK, and I grew up living in the rectory, which was right next to the church. And again, here I am, living in a rectory right next to the church. My life has a God-given symmetry to it. And it was during Holy Week, and the church that I grew up in, St. Paul's in Patchogue, we had a tradition we have here on Maundy Thursday, when we keep the watch, where people are invited to stay and pray in the chapel in response to Jesus' words, "Could you not watch with me 1 hour from the Garden of Gethsemane?" And so I remember, I was 14 or 15 years old, I decided that I was going to spend the whole night in the church. And I don't know if Mom remembers this, but I don't remember telling Mom and Dad I was going to do this. And they went to bed. And I'm not sure they knew that I was in the church. At least that's the way I remember it, Mom. But I was in the church all night, and it was one of the most extraordinary nights of my life. I did not have a Jeremiah moment, while you were the womb I formed you, and all that. But I can tell you this: I was so deeply aware of God's presence with me. I wouldn't have used this language later on. I've owned it. That Paul Tillich, the theologian of the mid-20th century, talked about God as the ground of all being. And I was aware at that night that the ground of all being was with me. And again, I didn't articulate this in the way I articulate it now, but I came out of that night saying to myself, I'm just not going to underlive my life. That my life is tied up with God's life, and that's always going to be the case. And I want that, and I know that, and I love that. And that has remained a conviction to this day for me from that night. Now today, among other things that we're doing here at St. Gregory's, is we're inviting all of our parents and grandparents and those who are caregivers for our children and youth to a special luncheon at the rectory and we're going to have a conversation about the work and calling to raise our children and our young people, and how do we do that, and what are some of our anxieties and hopes and dreams about all that. And so I thought I would just spend a moment sharing with the entire congregation some of my thoughts about that. My deepest anxieties for our children is that somehow they will not know God. That somehow their life would be severed, disconnected from the source of all being. That the flow and the power, the goodness of God's love and calling in their lives would somehow not be a part of who they are. and they would not have the structures around them, the parents or the other communities around them that would bring that out and help them to know and to respond to God's call. It's an anxiety that I share. And my hope for our children, in a sense, is the reverse, the flip side of that. My hope is that our children will deeply know how they are uniquely formed and made and uniquely loved by God. And they have a purpose and a calling in their lives, and that God is with them, has been with them, will always be with them, is beneath them, behind them, in front of them, beside them, and most of all within them. And that will be a source of life and joy and unending goodness for them in their lives. That's my hope for our children. And my hope is that we at St. Gregory's, our whole community, all of us, not just our youth programs, not just our Sunday school, but that all of it would help bring that out and nurture that for all of us as children of God, young and old. That's my dream for St. Gregory's. And God seems to know all of this because he calls Jeremiah the child. And Jeremiah, in response to God's call, of course says, I'm only a boy. Who am I to do this? Now, if you hadn't read this, and you would then ask, well, what do you think God says next? Some of you might say, okay, God might say, I understand. Let's keep talking, and maybe when you get a little older, you turn 18, and you're ready to go to college, we'll talk again, and I'll come to you. But that's not what God says. God isn't taking any excuses. And I preached on this before, God says, don't tell me you're only a boy. And he mixes what I would call the tough love with the tender love. You will go to who I send you, and you will say what I say. I was thinking about this, that you could do a whole Bible study, I've never done this before, about people who somehow have resisted God's call. Starting with Adam and Eve right in the garden. Don't touch that tree, that's the only thing you can't do. Of course, what do? Take the apple off the tree, kind of thing. And you talk about Jonah, the prophet. You remember Jonah? I want to send you to Nineveh. And Jonah gets on the ship and heads in the opposite direction. You can talk about Peter. Even if they arrest you and kill you, I'll never leave you, Jesus. Cock crows, and he heads off in the other direction. We're always resisting and pushing back against God's call. But you are loved and you are called, and God's got something for you to do. There's work to be done. Now you might say to me, Father Andrew, that sounds good, but what am I supposed to do? How do I know that? And let me help you out with that a little bit. I have these conversations often with people, and I love them, about discerning your calling and being more in touch, in tune with your calling. And the best way for me to enter this conversation with people is to say this. What is your great joy? What gives you the deepest sense of contentment, fulfillment, that this is really a source of deep, abiding joy for you? I think your calling is caught up with that. And one theologian once said, our calling is where our great joy and the world's great need meets. Because there's a lot of need out there in the world. This hurting, lonely, disconnected from God world. This world where the yachts have never enough on the back, as I talked about a couple weeks ago. A world that's just in a different place than where God would have us be. And our great joy and the world's need meet someplace. And that sweet spot is your calling. And you are called. And God's not taking excuses. You will go to who I send you. You will say what I will say to you. And here's the tenderness. I am with you to deliver you. I'm going to be beside you. You're not alone, and something good is going to happen out of this. So don't resist. You will find and be blessed in this. Now, Jeremiah's specific call is pretty extraordinary. You're to go to all the nations. And I just want to say something about the S on the word nations. God's calling and word is for all people. God doesn't just speak to a privileged group of people or a privileged country. God is a God of all people, all creation. This is not just Jesus of Nazareth that's doing the calling. This is the universal Christ that's doing the calling. All nations, all tribes, all people, for all time. So God gives Jeremiah that big vision. And then Jeremiah is told that he's going to have to do some rooting up and some plucking up and some destroying, or there's going to be some groundbreaking that happens. And as I thought about our own calling, we might not be sent to the nations like Jeremiah. Our calling might not be quite so grand in scope. But I do know that in my response to God's call, there's some things in me that have to be plucked up and rooted out. Our God is, as the letter to the Hebrews says, a consuming fire. A fire that purifies and refines. And so part of what happens when we respond to God's call is there is some of that breaking up of soil. There's some things that have to be removed and refined and planted. And thank God that God, the consuming fire, can do that. But then the other side is there's also some building and planting. In all the hope and promise of new life and goodness and healing that seems maybe caught up in those images of building and planting. Jesus is calling us, and there's work to be done. So I'll end with a final thought and a metaphor that comes from the gospel today, because I did want to just at least touch for a moment on the gospel. In the gospel story, we have this woman who comes to Jesus, and as you read the story, you can give a diagnosis and says that she has osteoporosis in some kind of advanced stage. She's bent over, it says, for 18 years. And I was thinking that, okay, that's what the world can do to us. The stress and anxiety and pressure of this life. It's not just this woman with osteoporosis is bent over, but in a sense, spiritually, we can feel, bent over and oppressed. And Jesus calls her. That's the theme today. He calls her over. And he heals her. And the word he uses there, he sets her free. Responding to God is liberating. It frees us to be who we're created to be in all that goodness. That's what Sabbath worship is all about. Rediscovering the liberation and healing of God's grace in Jesus on this day. And that's what happens in the story. So my encouragement as you respond to Jesus' call is the promise and hope of freedom and liberation that is part and parcel of the promise of Jesus. So to end it and to wrap it up, the story of Jeremiah is a story of God's calling. A calling to this unique and precious and beloved child. But it's the story of our calling. For you and I are unique and precious and beloved children. And Jesus is calling to set you free, not taking any excuses. There's good work to be done. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.